The Colosseum loomed over the city like a monument to war, its jagged spires casting long shadows over the thousands who had gathered to witness yet another display of dominance. The Zalari, a race of towering exoskeletal warriors, filled the arena with their guttural chants, the air thrumming with excitement. They had seen countless duels here, blood-soaked spectacles, where their kind proved their superiority over lesser species. Today was no different, or so they thought. High Lord Varesh stood at the center of the combat pit, motionless as a statue. His armor, a fusion of obsidian plating and pulsating energy veins, made him appear almost godlike beneath the flickering arena lights. In his grip, an energy blade hummed, its violet edge shifting and warping like liquid fire. He had wielded it in 100 battles against 100 doomed adversaries, and had yet to meet one who could last more than a few minutes against him. This was not arrogance, it was fact. The crowd roared as the human entered. Compared to Varesh, he was unremarkable. He lacked the bio-enhancements of the galaxy's apex predators. No armored carapace, no augmented strength. His frame was lean, his features sharp, eyes hard with the kind of discipline that only war could carve into a man. His name, Daniel Reyes, was spoken in murmurs across the audience, many still incredulous that the humans had dared to send him as their champion. He wore no powered exosuit, no energy shielding, only a worn combat uniform and a long single-edged steel sword strapped to his back. Primitive, laughable. Varesh tilted his head, curious in the way a predator humors a small, defiant creature before the kill. A voice, amplified across the arena, boomed from above. The Zalari Arbiter, seated in the high throne of judgment, raised a clawed hand to silence the spectators. By the decree of the Grand Warlords, this duel shall determine the fate of Earth and its people. Should the human warrior fall, humanity submits to the Zalari dominion. Should he triumph, the Arbiter let the words hang, as if the very notion was absurd. We shall recognize them as worthy equals, entitled to negotiate peace. A ripple of amusement passed through the Zalari ranks. Equals? The idea was laughable. Varesh barely acknowledged it, keeping his gaze locked on the human. Daniel stepped forward, unsheathing his sword in one smooth motion. The sound of steel sliding free was stark, almost unsettling in its simplicity. He tested its weight, rolling his wrist with the ease of a man who had performed the motion 1,000 times before. Then, with measured calm, he spoke. "You should have brought a real sword." A flicker of irritation crossed Varesh's alien features. The human did not cower, did not tremble as so many before him had. Instead, he stood there, utterly composed, as if this were merely another battle in a long line of battles. The Arbiter's hand fell. The duel began. Varesh moved first, as he always did. A blur of motion, faster than any human eye could track, his blade carving a violet arc through the air. It was meant to end the fight immediately. It always did. But Daniel was already moving. He twisted, the energy blade missing him by a breath, leaving only the scent of ionized air in its wake. He pivoted sharply, steel flashing as he retaliated, only for Varesh to parry with a fluidity that seemed effortless. Their weapons met in a shower of sparks, energy clashing against metal, the force of it rattling through Daniel's bones. The crowd erupted. There had been no instant kill, no immediate execution. Varesh stepped back, recalculating. That was unusual. Daniel exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders. "All right," he murmured to himself. "Let's see how long you can dance." The Zalari champion lunged again, this time adjusting, striking not with raw force, but with calculated precision. He tested the human's defenses, feinting left before curving his blade in an unpredictable arc. Yet, somehow, impossibly, Daniel adjusted just as quickly, deflecting the strike with the exact amount of movement required. No more, no less. For the first time in a century, Varesh felt something foreign creep into his mind. Curiosity. Daniel wasn't reacting randomly. He wasn't flailing, desperate to survive. He was studying, learning. The duel stretched on, seconds turning into minutes. Every exchange was faster, sharper. Varesh's strikes became more vicious, yet Daniel remained untouched, his counters impossibly precise. The human moved like water, his footwork honed to an art. Where other species fought with brute strength or raw speed, Daniel fought with something else entirely, an understanding of combat so deeply ingrained it bordered on instinct. The crowd's laughter had died. The chants had quieted. Varesh pressed forward, striking high, then low, then spinning into a devastating backhand slash. Daniel stepped into it, pivoting inside Varesh's reach, his sword flicking up, not to kill, not yet, but to graze the alien's gauntlet. The slightest of touches. A warning. Varesh's eyes widened as he disengaged, leaping backward. He glanced down. A shallow line, thin as a whisper, had been etched across his wrist plate. The energy shielding had flickered for just a fraction of a second. Had that strike been deeper, even by a fraction of an inch? The arena was silent. Daniel exhaled, rolling his wrist once more. His voice was quiet, almost lost in the cavernous space. Now you understand. The duel wasn't over. Not yet. But in that moment, the Zalari champion, undefeated, unquestioned in his supremacy, felt the first stirrings of doubt. And the human knew it. Varesh circled his opponent, his every step calculated, every muscle coiled like a wound spring. The human had defied expectations, but that only made his defeat inevitable. He had seen this before, lesser warriors who had managed to survive the first strike, only to be obliterated when the true battle began. It was time to stop testing and start dismantling. His blade flared brighter as he surged forward, faster than before, shifting his attacks into an erratic storm of slashes. Each stroke carried the weight of centuries of refined combat, the culmination of a warrior race's dominance. Yet the human met him, step for step, strike for strike, steel against energy. Daniel didn't block so much as redirect, his blade slipping between the arcs of Varesh's strikes like a whisper between breaths. The crowd had ceased their jeering. The murmurs of amusement had died. In their place, a quiet, simmering unease spread like a slow-moving wave. This was wrong. The human should have been dead by now. Varesh adjusted his stance, feinting a downward slice before twisting mid-motion, his blade arcing toward the human's ribs in an unpredictable shift. It was a killing stroke. Daniel stepped inside the attack at the last possible instant. Not away, not to the side, inside. It was a move of calculated risk, the kind only made by someone who had fought and survived enough battles to gamble on inches. The violet edge of the energy blade missed him by less than a breath as he twisted, his own sword cutting upward. Metal scraped against Varesh's wrist guard, a flicker of sparks trailing in its wake. Not deep enough to wound, but deep enough to remind. Varesh staggered back, his pulse hammering against his skull. That was twice now. Twice that the human had landed a touch, however small. He tightened his grip on his weapon, feeling the low hum of its power vibrate through his bones. He had not felt the need to focus like this in years. Daniel exhaled slowly, resetting his stance. His blade never wavered, his breathing steady. He hadn't spoken since the fight had begun. There was no taunting, no arrogance, no wasted energy. Only a patient, relentless precision that sent a cold realization creeping into Varesh's thoughts. The human wasn't simply reacting. He was learning. Varesh launched himself forward, pushing his speed beyond what most could follow. He swung low, forcing Daniel into a defensive retreat, pressing the attack with relentless momentum. Dust and debris kicked up around them as their movements blurred into a deadly dance, every impact sending shockwaves through the stone beneath their feet. Daniel moved with the efficiency of a seasoned warrior, adjusting, adapting. He never wasted a strike, never overcommit. His sword flashed as he knocked Varesh's blade aside, angling for a counter before stepping back just enough to avoid retaliation. For the first time, Varesh realized he was the one being studied. He twisted, aiming a brutal kick at the human's ribs. Daniel barely managed to roll with the impact, but it sent him skidding back several paces, dust curling around his boots as he regained his footing. "Interesting," Varesh murmured, his voice low. It was the first word he had spoken since the fight began. Daniel tilted his head, unreadable. "You're fast," he admitted. "Stronger than me, too." He rolled his wrist, adjusting his grip on the hilt of his sword. "But you fight like someone who's never had to struggle." Varesh narrowed his eyes. "You're used to overwhelming your enemies," Daniel continued, "to breaking them. But you've never had to grind for a victory, have you? Never had to fight for hours, bleeding, starving, knowing that losing means everything burns." Varesh remained silent. "That's the difference," Daniel said, voice calm. "You were born strong. I had to become this." The words landed harder than any strike. Varesh's grip tightened on his weapon, a strange weight settling in his chest. He had fought warlords, champions, creatures of monstrous size and strength. He had dueled against opponents with weapons that could shatter mountains. And yet here stood a simple human with a steel sword, one who refused to fall, who refused to break, whose eyes held not fear, but understanding. Daniel shifted his stance slightly, just enough for Varesh to notice. A small adjustment, almost imperceptible. He was preparing for something. The realization struck Varesh like a hammer. The human was leading him somewhere, guiding him, setting him up. A flicker of uncertainty crawled up his spine. He had never felt this before, not in all his years. And then Daniel moved. Not forward, not back, but through. He exploded into motion, faster than he had before, his blade snapping toward Varesh with terrifying precision. Varesh barely deflected the first strike before the second came, then the third. A relentless assault, each movement seamless, every cut aimed with merciless intent. Varesh blocked one, dodged another, but for the first time in his life, he felt himself losing ground. The human was no longer waiting, no longer studying. Now he was hunting. Varesh snarled, parrying desperately, but Daniel was already inside his guard. A sharp twist, a sudden shift in weight. Steel met flesh. Not deep, not fatal, but enough. Varesh staggered back, exhaling sharply. His armor, once pristine, now bore a single unmistakable cut across the chest. Thin, but precise. Intentional. The arena was silent. Daniel took a slow breath, lowering his sword. "Now," he said quietly, "we see what happens when you have to fight uphill." And for the first time in his existence, Varesh felt something cold curl in his gut. Doubt. A thin line of dark ichor trailed down Varesh's chest, seeping from the shallow cut in his armor. It wasn't deep enough to be dangerous, but the weight of it, the sheer impossibility of it, made his limbs feel heavier than they had in years. His breath came sharp and controlled, yet he could not ignore the silence pressing in from the Colosseum stands. Thousands of his kin, warriors who had only ever witnessed victory, now sat frozen, watching their champion bleed. Daniel Reyes had not moved since delivering the strike. He stood as he had from the beginning, calm, balanced, sword steady in his grip. He wasn't celebrating. He wasn't taunting. That was the worst part. He expected more. Varesh ground his teeth and adjusted his stance. The weight of his blade was still familiar in his grip, the power coursing through it still an extension of himself. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The battle had shifted. He was no longer the predator. He lunged. Daniel met him, steel flashing as their weapons clashed. But this time, the rhythm was different. Varesh had always been faster, stronger, but now that advantage felt distant, like something slipping through his fingers. The human wasn't fighting to keep up. He was fighting to win. Varesh's blade came down in a brutal overhead strike, powerful enough to carve through solid stone. Daniel sidestepped at the last moment, the edge of the energy blade grazing the air where his shoulder had been. Before Varesh could recover, Daniel pivoted low and struck. Not at the obvious weak points, but at the gaps in movement, the milliseconds between attack and reset, the spaces where no warrior ever expected to be punished. A precise slash at the knee joint. A flick of steel that clipped the exposed edge of Varesh's gauntlet. A counter-strike that sent vibrations up his forearm, forcing him back. Varesh's mind raced, calculations failing him. He was used to overwhelming opponents with sheer force, with speed and aggression that left them gasping, scrambling to survive. But Daniel wasn't scrambling. He was adjusting, adapting. The more Varesh pushed, the more refined the human's responses became. It was like fighting something that learned in real time, something that grew stronger with every exchange. And Varesh was tiring. It was subtle at first, just the faintest burn in his muscles, the smallest hesitation before his next movement. But Daniel saw it. Of course he saw it. "You feel it now," Daniel said, voice quiet, words measured between breaths. Varesh ignored him and struck again. A feint, then a twisting slash meant to catch the human off guard. Daniel deflected it without effort. "You've never had to last this long, have you?" Daniel continued, sidestepping another blow. "Never had to conserve yourself. Always the strongest. Always the fastest." A sharp counter came, aimed at Varesh's side. He barely managed to turn, deflecting it at the last moment. But strength fades. Speed slows. Another cut, this one carving a shallow line across his forearm. Not deep, but enough to make his grip falter. And when they do, a third cut, barely avoided. Varesh could hear his own breathing now, could feel the sweat forming beneath his armor. All that's left is will. Daniel surged forward, and for the first time in centuries, Varesh stumbled. The impact came fast, a brutal palm strike to the chest, knocking him back. Varesh caught himself before he could fall completely, but the damage had been done. He was panting now, his vision narrowing, his body betraying him in ways he could scarcely comprehend. Across from him, Daniel was breathing evenly. He could go on for hours. Varesh's mind rebelled against the truth clawing its way through his thoughts. He was Zalari, the apex of warrior kind, the undefeated, the unstoppable. And yet, here he stood, stripped down to something raw, something vulnerable. He growled low in his throat and did something he had never done before. He reached beyond his limits. A sharp, electric crack split the air as his energy blade flared, pulsing with a deeper, more volatile glow. The gathered Zalari warriors in the stands inhaled sharply. They knew what this meant. Varesh was breaking his own code, drawing upon the forbidden reserves of his bloodline. Energy that could not be sustained, power that burned brighter than a star before collapsing. He could still win. He would still win. Varesh moved. The force of it sent cracks through the stone beneath his feet, his entire form a blur of violet light and deadly precision. His blade cut through the air in a storm, each strike carrying enough force to break bones, to sever limbs. Daniel met him head-on. Steel met energy in a dazzling eruption of sparks. Varesh pressed forward, each strike growing wilder, more desperate. He wasn't holding back anymore. He was all in. The human faltered. Just for a second. Just long enough. Varesh saw his opening and took it. A brutal backhand sent Daniel sprawling, his sword skidding across the ground. The human rolled, pushing himself up to one knee, but Varesh was already there, his blade humming at his throat. Silence. The Zalari roared in triumph. But Varesh didn't move, didn't strike the final blow. Daniel didn't flinch. He was breathing hard now, dust and sweat streaking his face. But his eyes, they weren't afraid. They weren't defeated. Varesh's grip on his blade tightened. This was it, the moment of victory. And yet, as he stared at the human, at the warrior who had pushed him to his limits, something inside him twisted. Daniel exhaled, voice barely above a whisper. "You know I'm right." Varesh hesitated. And that was all the human needed. With a sharp twist, Daniel knocked the energy blade aside and moved. Faster than before, faster than Varesh had thought possible. His sword was back in his grip before the Zalari champion could react. And then the steel was against Varesh's throat. Not cutting. Not yet. Holding. Waiting. The Zalari crowd fell into stunned silence. Daniel's expression was unreadable, but his voice was steady. "Strength fades," he repeated, "but skill endures." Varesh swallowed, his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. For the first time in his life, he was unarmed. And for the first time in his life, he understood. The weight of the steel blade against his throat was unfamiliar, not the sensation of impending death. Varesh had faced that countless times in training, in battle, in the rituals that had forged him into what he was. No, this was different. This was restraint. The human could have ended it, could have carved through his throat with a flick of the wrist. And yet he did not. The silence in the Colosseum was absolute. Thousands of Zalari warriors, bred for war, raised in conquest, sat motionless in their seats. No chants, no roars, no triumphant cries, just the oppressive stillness of a species witnessing the impossible. Daniel Reyes met Varesh's gaze without wavering. His grip on the sword was firm, steady. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't seeking submission. He was simply waiting. Varesh had always known victory. It had been written into his bloodline, reinforced in every trial, every duel, every campaign waged across the stars. His people did not lose. They did not falter. And yet, standing here unarmed, with a cold edge of steel pressing against his skin, he understood a truth his kind had spent centuries avoiding. They were not invincible. He exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of that realization settle deep within his core. He could feel the energy still crackling at his fingertips, his body still primed to fight, to surge forward in one last desperate attempt. But it would be futile, not because Daniel was stronger, but because he was better. Varesh clenched his jaw. His instincts, his training, his very nature screamed at him to resist, to deny the loss, to take the hit, to gamble on a final strike, to do anything but accept defeat. But in the end, all of those thoughts boiled down to a single, unavoidable conclusion. He had lost. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hands, a warrior's surrender. Not out of fear, not out of humiliation, but out of something deeper. Something he had never been allowed to consider before. Respect. Daniel didn't move at first, his expression unreadable. Then, after a beat, he took a step back and lowered his sword. The crowd remained silent, the tension hanging thick in the air. Varesh could feel the weight of his people's gaze, the unspoken question burning in every Zalari's mind. What now? Varesh looked at Daniel, then at the blade in his hand. A simple thing, unadorned, unenhanced. No energy coursing through its edge. No advanced alloy forged in the heart of a dying star. Just steel. Old. Primitive. And yet, in the right hands, unstoppable. He exhaled sharply, something between a breath and a laugh. You fight like a man who has nothing left to prove. Daniel rolled his shoulders, the tension of battle bleeding from his stance. I fight like a man who's had to prove it too many times. Varesh studied him, searching for arrogance, for self-satisfaction, for the quiet cruelty that so many warriors carried after victory. He found none. Only the steady, calm resolve of a man who had simply done what he needed to do. The Zalari in the stands did not know what to do with this moment. They had expected a spectacle, a crushing display of dominance, their champion standing victorious over yet another challenger. Instead, they had been forced to witness something they had never encountered before. A lesson. Varesh turned, lifting his chin to the assembled warriors. You have watched, he called out, his voice steady, unwavering. You have seen. He gestured toward Daniel, without breaking his gaze from his people. This human stands alive because he is worthy. A ripple of unease spread through the crowd. Worthiness was a concept they understood well, but never before had it been attributed to an outsider, let alone a victor. Daniel tilted his head slightly. That's a dangerous thing to say. Varesh let out a breath that might have been amusement. Then let it be dangerous. He turned back to the human. We believed ourselves beyond challenge, beyond failure. You have reminded us that nothing is beyond challenge. His eyes flicked down to the blade, still in Daniel's grip. Or beyond change. Daniel studied him for a long moment before nodding once. Good. The simplicity of the response sent another murmur through the watching crowd. No grand speech. No demand for recognition. Just an acknowledgement of what had transpired. Varesh looked over his people one final time before stepping forward and dropping to one knee. Not in submission, not in surrender, but in respect. For the first time in history, a Zalari champion knelt before an outsider. And in that moment, everything changed.